So I've had a couple of inquiries about bias, and so I wanted to just take a second, record a quick little video. We'll leave it up on our YouTube page so that if you want to go back for a reference, you can see that. So first let's talk about how fabric is made. So fabric is made warp and weft, and I don't remember which direction is which at this moment, but there's threads that are on the vertical and there are threads that are on the horizontal, and all fabric that is sold as quilting cotton is woven in this way. Up, down, left, right. The fabric then has points at which it wants to crease. And so folding with one of those two directions means that you get a crisp folded line. And if you're ever working with a loose weave fabric, like a homespun or linen, then you can see that actually happening. Now, when we want something to curve and flow, we do it on the bias. Bias has a couple of different moods, and one of the moods that bias has is that it will stretch along that line, because now all those warp and wefts are being allowed to do this. So warp and weft stretch on the bias, and you end up with like all sorts of flowy things happening. And in a quilt, that's a pain in the bum. So we don't often endeavor to cut on the bias, but there are times we do. And one of the things we cut on the bias is when we're making bias applique. So we cut on the bias then, and that means that it's going to stretch nicely and curve nicely. So we do the bias cuts for that reason. Then when we are doing anything where we're going to bind in a curve, we do that on the bias again, so that it stretches in one direction and goes nicely around a curve. And when we do that, we're doing it with bias tape. So bias then is the 45-degree angle from warp and weft. And so on your ruler, so I'm going to switch to the close-up view of things here. On your ruler, that's going to show up as the 45-degree line right there. And that's our 45-degree line, and here it is in the other direction. And the dotted line on this ruler, the yellow line, actually passes through that 45-degree circle that's in the middle there. And so that's our bias guide. So if you wanted to make bias tape, and I'm going to do it with a fat quarter today, we've got this fat quarter that I can play with. The very first thing I do is I cut off my selvage. And you should do that whenever you're working with fabric, and that's because the weave on selvage is often tighter, denser, often has poly in that it's not it's not considered part of the fabric. This is where the pins on the bolts of fabric, when they're spooling it, that's where the pins are. So you'll often see pin marks in your bias, and it is very tough fabric. We don't want this in our quilts because it will cause lumps in your quilts and will actually sometimes even cause a tear line. So cut your selvages off, and so that's what I've done here. The next step is to take your fabric. So now I've got a nice straight edge on one side, and then you take your 45-degree line, which is on this ruler, is right here, right? So, and I lay that along the weave. So in this particular fabric, I want everything to be perfectly on with these little check marks. So I've laid my 45-degree line along one of the stripes. I could also say to heck with it, and I could lay it right along the edge of the fabric like this, and I cut a 45-degree line. And when I run out at the end of here, because I've run out of ruler, because the fat quarter is a little bit wider, I can add a second ruler and just butt it up towards the end. Which I did not plan to do, but there we go. So we'll butt it right up against the end. It's nice and square on there, and I can continue cutting from there. So now I've got a perfect bias cut in my piece of fabric. So now if I wanted to cut 1-inch strips, let's say, I would take my ruler, line it up right along that cut at the 1-inch line. That's going to be my 1 inch. A good case for having rulers that are more than 24 inches apparently. Right along there. Okay, and I can pull it away again. some point here I'm not going to need the second ruler. We'll cross our fingers it's this time. So there I'm going to, woohoo, there's my point. Okay, so I line up my 1-inch line right along the edge of the fabric. Another 1-inch strip. And this will go very quickly. So when you have to make bias, this is our method. Strip, strip, strip. Now I have strip. Ta-da! So that's how you cut perfect bias strips. I hope you all have a good rest of your project, and we'll talk to you soon.